Well, hi everyone, and welcome to class number 2 of Virtual Reality 201 here at FX PhD. And today what we're going to do is introduce the creative that we're going to be executing for the duration of the term, starting out with the shoot next week and then following it into post and distribution. Before we get to that, just want to again welcome Scott. Thanks for joining us. Sure. And Alex, thanks for helping out with the course.
My pleasure.
It's cool because you've been doing a lot of work related to VR, so we're happy to rely on you for this. What we're going to do today is talk about what we're going to do, and part of that involves us, but part of that will hopefully involve you to help contribute to this overall project that we're creating that we won't necessarily be finishing this term, but at the end of the term, after all of you submit it, we hope to have a really nice showcase piece that we can actually put on the front page of FX PhD, maybe pimp it a bit over at Effects Guide. So we really hope you'll take part in this. So let's go ahead and kind of walk through that creative. And what we did here is I tried to approach something what I thought like an ad agency creative would come to me with, okay? We got this idea that we want to do, and I've done some frames and things like that. And so that's kind of the approach that I took in doing these frames, knowing that they weren't quite right. But if we take a look at these, and we've handed these out as part of the course, I'm basically going to start out with me talking and introducing this piece, saying I'm John Montgomery, one of the co-founders, blah, blah, blah. And this is a really cool VR piece. Now I'm going to be holding a soccer ball. And like the American that I am, I'm going to be actually throwing that soccer ball instead of kicking it to myself across over our heads in VR, and I'm going to catch it on the other side and actually continue my intro. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about all our members all around the world, and that we've created this piece that will actually link all these various pieces that our members do. So the idea will be, I'll then take the ball and then throw it back over the camera to someone to be determined, and that's one of you. And hopefully it will be maybe someone in Paris standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, maybe someone in front of the Taj Mahal, or Big Ben, or something like that. And what will happen is you'll catch the ball and then say something about yourself and then toss the ball back to someone else, another member of FX PhD. So again, it's me introducing, I toss the ball to myself on the other side of the camera, talk a little bit more, throw the ball to someone, they talk, throw the ball to someone else, and that's our piece. So, what challenges come to mind right off the bat in taking a look at this?
Well, I think the first challenges I'd look at would be creatively how you've got this great opportunity, I think, to show all these different environments, and that's what's really fun about the piece, is getting to be in a 360 space in London, in France, in LA, New York, wherever. The challenge, I think, one of the challenges will be how are we going to transition between all those environments once you get into post. If this were a 2D spot, I think we'd probably try to like bury a transition somewhere in the motion blur of a nice whip pan to the other person catching the ball, or we would just have a hard cut. You can cut in VR, but it's a little disconcerting.
Right.
So probably some experimentation once you've shot some footage in terms of how do you want to get from point A to point B, so to speak.
Right.
How are you going to handle changing that environment?
In considering those environments, though, we'll talk about that. How similar do those various environments do you feel need to be? For instance, things like people are maybe going to be using different camera rigs, but what about camera height and framing and horizon? What are we going to run into?
Well, I think it's best if you level out your camera system, and it's best if we decide on or work out a height so everybody's on the same page with that. So as we cut, and also have everybody a set distance away, to try to have it as consistent as possible. Obviously, this is a tutorial example, so we're not going to be super crazy about it. We want it to be a fun piece, I think, for the students, but just having some consistency there is going to be important.
Well, I think one of the things that we talked about last week in the class, or just amongst ourselves, that would be really helpful is taking a look at these boards, which are certainly not lat longs or spherical images. They're traditional HD style frames, but kind of figuring out what we would actually get into when filming this. And I think that this little rig here, the Ricoh Theta, is actually, it's great for stills, but I think it actually really is fantastic for actually visualizing what we're going to do. So what I did is I actually ended up taking a couple tests with Jeff Huser that I've got fired up here on the computer. And what I did is actually set myself up about 5 feet from the camera, 10 feet from the camera, and then 15 feet from the camera, and just basically tossed the ball over the center of the camera, which is kind of what we're thinking of doing, just to kind of see what that feeling was. So I looked at these videos, and immediately I think, Alex, I told you, man, you know what? 5 and 10, that's what we want to do, because 15 just seems way too far away.
Right, subject seems small in frame.
Incredibly small. If we look at the videos as they're shown here in the 360 viewer, which you would get online.
Well, because everything that we're shooting is pretty much with fisheye or with very wide lenses, so you kind of have to start getting into that mode of seeing things that way.
Well, and understanding though that how you see it on the computer screen is not necessarily how you're ultimately going to be viewing it. And as you mentioned, when we look at it 15 feet there, it does seem very small. But to accurately simulate where your field of view is going to be, either you can pick the laptop up and press it against your face, or we could put the videos on a gear or an Oculus or something like that to get a better idea of what it should look like.
And I will reenact my enactment of the 5-foot version where I turned around and looked at myself and was like, whoa, I am really close to the camera.
Very, very close.
Well, and all of that kind of demonstrates the need to do the test and to figure out the specific headsets that you're going for. Is it going to be online? Is it going to be on a headset? Which particular one? Because right now most of these are like 90 to 110 degrees, although they're looking at making much wider viewpoints. So that could change in the future. So you need to kind of consider that and try to test out through the pipeline, or at least enough so that you're verifying, you know, the size and frame that you want to get.
Yeah, so that was actually, again, a really useful tool for figuring that out. The other thing that actually helped figure out, and I think and kind of sold home a couple things, and that's, I think that what's going to be important is, even though we're creating a 360 environment, framing, or at least setup of your shot is important. And number 2, ball toss.
Yeah, I think that overhead is nice. I think it's probably gives us our easiest method for getting the ball for a close camera, if that's what we want to do. Especially if we're going to have a situation where a lot of different people shoot these vignettes and then trying to combine them together. Trying to sort of go alongside the camera would probably be a harder pickup. And then in terms of like technical hurdles, and not that we ever want to let technical hurdles really drive our creative, so to speak, but one thing to consider is that if the ball is against sky, that's generally going to be a more forgiving transition or crossing of stitch lines when it's mostly nondescript sky behind it that is well far behind it, as opposed to dealing with like parallax issues of a ball traveling and then potentially like varying layers of depth behind the ball.
And what about framing? What about the thought about setting up framing?
Well, what we've talked about, you know, obviously with VR, you're seeing 360, so you don't have the typical framing that you would on a narrative film. But framing is still critical because whether it's 2 people throwing a ball, ping pong, or 2 actors, the question is, where do you want to place that camera? Because if you place it far enough back, then the person can view both of that, and once again, it depends on the field of view that you're going to finally see it, without moving their head, or you could be a little bit closer so they move their head slightly, or you could be right in the center. And that's kind of where we are with this. So now we're having the audience do that. And that's one of the problems, you know, with, which I've seen in some other things, is you end up with audience whiplash. You know, they're doing this. So what we'll probably ask the people to do is hold on to the ball for a moment and talk, or say, here I am, whatever, and then toss, so it's not like a constant thing. And obviously the audience has the option of just turning their head sideways instead of trying to follow the ball, you know, but it does give a good cue over. But that's part of it, is just trying to get big enough so that you could see people clearly, or whatever you want to see, but not so much that people have to constantly move their heads.
And it's important, I think, to remember what the viewer has control over and what they don't control. Your viewer, if we're doing a video, which is essentially going to be baked down into a lat long, the viewer is going to have a chance to control rotation, but not translation. So the viewer doesn't have the ability to reframe wider on the two people. Like you mentioned, two people having a conversation.
Right.
Well, if I'm doing this for an extended period of time just to see the person talking and the other person's reaction, that's not very comfortable. Now, I, as the viewer, don't really have the option to pull back and reframe once the video is finished. So you, the cinematographer, you, the director, have to consider that and think about, do you want a comfortable framing, or are you trying to make your audience uncomfortable? What's your creative goal there?
Right.
It really is like a whole new set of storytelling tools that are sort of at your disposal. But you have to consider they can't move, you can move.
Right.
And then they're essentially on rails with the ability to look around.
Well, and which brings up an interesting point for the creative, especially a narrative type of thing. If I bring in a character from the side and he starts talking, especially if we have the spatialized sound, now that's a surprise. And obviously we're starting to see a lot of horror type of things in this genre. But likewise, you have comedy where it's based on surprise, but if somebody's already looked over here, they might see the guy creeping up with the pie or something, So it's an interesting mix, and certainly from a storytelling telling standpoint, we're still trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way to tell all these stories? But with this project, obviously we're looking at the basics of framing, but as we make longer pieces, more edits and things, we have to kind of consider all those things. And once again, something like the Theta becomes very useful for trying out ideas and very quickly and easily.
Something that this sort of heat maps show, when you're tracking what people are looking at in VR, is that people who are maybe in our line of work tend to look all over because they know they're supposed to. And also, in my case, I just want to see how good it is. So I start to look for the errors, especially in live action. But your average person who puts it on a lot of times has to be told that they can look all around. So something to consider is if it were live theater or a concert or a sporting event or whatever it was, you'd position yourself as a viewer somewhere where you could see most of the action without having to turn around too much. You'd want to reserve those moments for when they made sense, to draw everyone's attention over here and draw everyone's attention back. But it's a creative decision. And it can be used however you want it to be. I think for this piece with the ball, it makes sense to have a little bit of that back and forth at key moments because, again, we do need some mechanism for getting around the world, so to speak. So having some impetus to look behind us or look forward so that we have some way to transition would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think in the opening sequence, what will help is, number one, I'll be speaking, so you'll not only have the ball, but you'll also have me to cause them to turn. And then, so hopefully, the second time that I throw the ball, they'll actually hopefully understand the gag a bit more. The ball toss was also an interesting thing if you look at this video. If you take a look at the first one I did, I actually threw the ball in several different locations. I think you had a reaction where you go, whoa, I think on one of them close to the camera. But the reality is, that was another thing about the ball toss and the depth and how far I was from the camera. It was way easier and less jarring to actually follow that ball when you were further away. You could actually, if you wanted to, in the case farther away from camera, you could actually follow it.
It's a slower arc at that.
Right, you could actually track the ball from one hand to the other, as opposed to where the 5-foot one, it's in the other person's hands and you probably missed it.
And many people, we were showing this, holding this, many people will have this mounted on their head. And you can actually turn your head faster when it's mounted. If you're using cardboard or something else, your hands on it actually also further slow the speed at which you can actually turn. So that's another consideration in that ball toss.
Well, although the cardboards are not as responsive as something like the Gear and the Oculus.
It's also, I think, important to differentiate creatively when you're sort of designing your VR shoot or whatever it is, to know that you're going to do it for head-mounted display as opposed to a 360 viewer on a computer, because those are two very, very different experiences, and having to sort of mouse back and forth to follow the ball, if it were happening too quickly, might be a little too much click and drag, whereas it's at least a little more intuitive and easy to turn your head around.
Well, and likewise on the computer, you also have, with some of the different players, you can actually shrink it down or blow it up. So you have,
That's right.
as a user, you're able to do that, but once again, on the headsets, you aren't.
Right.
So I think our target market of choice will be the Gear VR, the S6 or the Note 4 or something like that. They're similar enough to have those considerations. And you'll see when playing around with the videos that we send out, taking a look at them in the Ricoh Theta app compared to actually looking at them on the headset, you can see firsthand what we're talking about.
And it'll still be enjoyable, I think, for people who don't have access to a head-mounted display.
Well, so that's the creative that we have here in this project, but there are other things that you need to consider if someone's going to bring you a job. A big one is movement. We decided intentionally not to deal with movement in this case, just to get the basics of the post and shooting correct. But what are the main considerations to be aware of regarding movement?
Well, I think it comes back to what we discussed a little bit earlier, which is what the viewer has control over and what they don't. Viewer can't translate, so translation is a fun thing to do with the camera in VR. Viewer can rotate, so if rotation, forced rotation, I guess you would call it, if we're going to actually be rotating the camera rig ourselves, is something that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable when viewing VR. Most people can deal with an amount of translation because we're used to an experience where you sit and you feel like you're moving back and forth, whether you're watching, or playing first-person video game or doing whatever it is that you're doing. But if you have a lot of rotation that the viewer doesn't control, especially small micro adjustment rotation, that's the type of thing that tends to make people pretty ill. Because if I'm sitting perfectly still on the headset, but my world is constantly doing this, that's...
It's like you have vertigo at that point because you're seeing this world move in front of you. And the 360 is certainly a different experience than just going into a movie theater and sitting up close to the screen. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see people right now experimenting in the space, sort of finding out what feels right. Some people are intentionally pushing it far enough to make people sick on purpose, just to see, what they can do with that from a creative standpoint, which is, I think, great. But your brain, when you start out, you might want to start with slower, controlled, constant direction movement, because that's easier for most people to take. If you have a lot of little micro adjustments and little micro rotations, it's almost like your brain can't quite keep up to process those out or to accept the fact that you are moving even though you don't feel it. That's why a lot of VR experiences that they do with road shows now, if they're promoting a film and they have a VR experience, they'll have one of those 4D chairs to give you a little jolt when there's movement, because then just even like a little bit of a micro movement, like a ride film, is enough to tell your brain you're moving and make it feel okay. But for the purposes of me just sitting in the chair wearing one of these, I really want to eliminate as much little movement as possible that seems like it should be coming from the viewer rather than the camera.
Yeah,
right?
I'm actually very susceptible to it. I actually watch the Extreme Action GoPro VR clips exclusively on YouTube VR and on the desktop, as opposed to actually watching in the headset, and that's an extreme example.
Well, any of that handheld type of motion, and once again, I've seen that type of stuff done, and you want to avoid that where the horizon line's doing this type of stuff and bouncing all over. For a lot of experience, I mean, if you can do it from a static position, then that's going to cover everybody. And as you start moving it more and more, then you're going to have, and that's the thing, so Oculus and some of the other stores now for the VR, they have kind of a rating system about how comfortable this is for you. Yeah. The other thing that you're looking at is also potential presence, the feeling that you're truly there. Now, if the camera's moving around, especially it's making odd moves, then that takes you out of that. Whereas if you're sitting down, and that also becomes an issue. If I want to make it feel like I'm really there, then I've got to think, okay, is the audience member going to be sitting down viewing this on a headset? Or are they going to be standing up? What is my height? If I set it at 9 feet, then I'm not going to get the same experience as if I'm sitting down. So all of those things, you know, when you're looking at VR experiences, you got to kind of think about all of those that you wouldn't normally with the traditional film, obviously.
Well, I think some of the things we've learned from traditional filmmaking still apply. I mean, you know, if you think of your favorite really long shots in films, like how many of them are static? Like not many.
Right.
You know, if you're thinking about a Scorsese Steadicam shot,
Right.
or that amazing shot that begins Gravity, what makes those work is the movement. And VR is not too different in that. I mean, if you spend more than a few seconds completely static in a place, there has to be a lot or enough going on to hold your attention that you don't want to cut. Because in your average film these days, I feel if you're on a static shot, people are cutting every 3 seconds or less.
Right.
So it's kind of a similar rule of thumb. You want something to happen that forces the viewer to either look somewhere else so that they're changing perspective on their own, or you want to be moving the camera around to create a little bit more life and interest.
Right. And part of that depends on, you know, once again, what you're trying to do. If you're putting somebody in Times Square and their whole thing is just to look around, then at that point you probably want to just keep it static. And if you know, it's just trying to, you know, figure out the edit process and make sure that it's a comfortable experience, but it's telling the story.
And I think with our case, that's a good example, because hopefully in our case, what's happening is we're going to some really interesting locations where is a static camera, but you're going to want people to kind of look around. Where am I now? What am I seeing? And we need to find that sweet spot to talk about, you know, before shoot.
Well, we essentially are cutting, right?
Yeah, we are cutting. Yeah, and you know, is it 15 seconds where people's attention? Okay, I want to go to the next scene now. I'm tired of this. What are we going to do?
Well, and that's the thing. When you make the cuts right now, people want to look around a little bit, and so it's just like especially if you're dealing with stereo, obviously you slow down your cuts typically with stereo movies, and so you would do something similar with VR so that people can get, oh, where am I now type of thing, especially if you made a big jump, then they tend to glance around at least once they've used to the concept of looking around.
Well, okay, so taking back to our shoot, let's just recap with some of the main things that I think we've touched on. They're the things that we're going to consider. Number one, framing, at least when you're filming the scene, photographing the scene, that is going to be important. You're going to want to have that person front and center. For the ball toss, we're going to want to have it tossed right over the camera for that reason. So it will give us purposes for matching if we have to even move the ball or something weird.
Hopefully we won't hit the rig.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, hit the rig.
And I guess the other thing to mention, in post, we can actually rotate exactly where we start on. You know, so if we wanted to rotate and have two people on, you know, 180 this way versus that way, we can do that.
Yes.
I mean, then, you know, that brings up other post issues.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thing that you can reframe horizontally in the post process.
Yes, you can.
Right. And then distance from the camera we've kind of looked at, and we'll look at it again, but it seems like that 15 foot, at least from the test I did of 5, 10, and 15, seemed much better.
That seemed like a good mix between being able to clearly see the person and having enough time to track the ball.
Because we are also fighting the resolution of the image as well. The further I get from the camera, which is fine, you see less detail of me, but in general you want to keep that kind of detail. The other thing, camera height. I did a test where initially I'd actually put it at my eye level, which I actually feel like, selfishly, it's my height. That's what I want to experience in the world, and that seemed to work pretty well. Because when I moved that camera up, even a foot, I was kind of towering over myself and Jeff in that scene. So that's important. So we'll make sure that we lock a camera height. Yeah, standing height. So we want to make sure we lock the camera.
Again, a creative choice for people to make, right?
Right.
I mean, the same as with stereo. People have always, like in Alice in Wonderland, they play with the interocular or the interaxial separation, so that if it's Alice's POV when she's huge, you know, they might move the cameras very far apart, which has the tendency to sort of miniaturize what she's looking at. And if she's really small and it's her POV, they would move them very close together to have the opposite effect.
Right.
So same thing with camera height. Do you want to feel like very short, or that you're sitting on the grass, or do you want to feel very tall, or do you want to feel about average height?
One thing I wish is I'd actually taken the camera down that opposite way, because I do feel that potentially it might be more interesting a little lower. Looking up might be easier to follow the ball, but that's another test to do.
Well, and I think you had brought up earlier, Alex, the whole idea of you want to minimize jumping up and down between cuts.
Right.
You know, so you want to kind of keep a consistency. Obviously, we're doing this because of the planned shots, but even when you're going from disparate shots, you don't want to typically go, 9 feet up and then 5 inches off the ground, just because
it takes people a moment to reorient, and some people will not feel comfortable. They'll feel ill. It's the same as doing a depth edit with a stereo film and not wanting to jump to a convergence point that's, say, 2 feet away from your face when the last one was 100 feet. It takes your brain a moment to process.
Right.
So no different actually for camera placement when it comes to VR.
And then the other thing is just pacing and timing of the little segments that we're doing. We want to make sure that we avoid that ping-pong effect, because again, we've talked about and hit this nail, talked about it several times now. We just want to give people time to breathe and relax and not be bouncing back and forth. Unless they want to. They can look at what's happening behind the camera and see what's back there. That's
you
one
can
of the
stare
great
at the
things.
ground the whole time if you please. Yeah.
Feel free.
No one can stop you.
So now we've had this discussion, we've discussed this a lot, but you know what we haven't actually touched on, which is I think really important in telling, we haven't actually talked at all about gear at this point, right? I mean, which is actually, that's part of the process, is talk about the creative, talk about the other things that are related, and now have the creative of what we're doing drive how we're going to shoot. So let's talk about this in two parts, because I think we're going to have kind of different setups. First is this first part with the John twins, where I'm on camera and I walk kind of around the scene a little bit, and then throw it to myself.
Right.
Catch the ball, talk some more, and then throw it to person to be named later. It seems like with this, we don't need to actually film, and we can't really, because we need two of me to film in 360 all at once. So you had an interesting suggestion about an approach to use, which also frankly makes for a good learning experience on top of it.
Right. Well, we talked about the possibility of that we could shoot this with a 360 rig, and just sort of use the fact that we shot some automatic clean plate where you're going to be while we shot you over here, just kind of patching you out until you're supposed to be there to catch the ball, or having you there the entire time if that's what you want. So there's actually two Johns at all times. There's some options there. We could still do that with the 360 rig, but we also have the option, depending on the nature of our environment, of shooting the whole thing single camera on a nodal head. Now, if we've got a lot of activity around you, you mentioned potentially going to a busy place like Venice Beach or something, then we would want a 360 rig because we want to capture all that activity. But if you were to be, as you were in the test, sort of alone in the street, we could shoot it all single camera. We shoot you in one location. We turn the camera around on its nodal axis. We shoot you in the other location. And then what we would do on any VFX shoot where we want to get clean tiles of an environment, either for building a digital environment later, doing cleanup wherever we might tell production we need that and make everyone wait for us. We can then just take the camera and do like basically a pano.
Sure.
And if we've got a little movement of the trees or grass that we want to keep alive, maybe instead of doing stills, we're rolling on 10, 20 seconds of video, whatever it is. But then we would have the ability later to still stitch that into a 360 with the added bonus of it actually being far easier to stitch because we'd be rotating around a nodal point as opposed to dealing with the parallax issues that we're going to find ourselves faced with any 360 rig that we use.
Right. So, I mean, and using that same technique, you can shoot inside a static room or something where things are not going to cross that line, or you're on a stage. Or you can take advantage of it like you're doing here, but I could have, one camera and shoot a band member for a music video at each location. Or have specific action, as long as they remain within the seam lines, as it were.
Right.
You've got opportunities for action.
And you do actually have the option for your subject to be moving around the center point, as long as it's slow enough that in following them with the camera, you aren't creating like a huge amount of rolling shutter or motion blur problems.
Right.
Because you do have the ability later on, if you do a match move, which on a nodal move should be fairly simple, you could almost just do it as 2D track, then you do have the ability to stabilize that out later and reproject it inside the sphere and essentially get someone walking around the center point in 360, all filmed with single camera. So a lot of fun options.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Again, something that's very approachable for the members to go out and try that. Those are all techniques, I think, apart from building this environment, that are familiar to us as visual effects artists. But one of the things we do want to do for this course is actually take a look at some principles and learn. And I thought you had a great idea, which is kind of splitting the difference between those two. And that's some kind of high-end rig, like a red rig with 2 fisheye lenses.
Right. And what that would sort of give us is we would see some of the trade-offs that we make when we step up to a nicer camera body than a GoPro. We see what we gain and what we lose. And what we gain is image fidelity, control over exposure and color temperature, being able to gen lock the cameras and have our time code all be in sync, all the things that we can't really do with GoPros as they currently stand. But what we sacrifice is the closeness of the camera.
Because of the sheer size of the
exactly.
rads,
Like
right?
from a
The
practical
fisheyes.
standpoint, we are going to have a larger sort of translation separation between our camera bodies, and therefore be dealing with larger amounts of parallax. You mentioned fisheye lenses. Obviously, the wider your lens, the less camera bodies you need to get 360 degrees of coverage. So with like some of the red rigs I've used in the past, we've gone either all fisheyes or we've gone all fisheyes except for our hero camera, which we do a regular lens because we want to maximize resolution around that area. The trade-off there, of course, being coverage versus crispness of image.
Right.
Because those fisheyes, you'll find, get really soft around the edges because of the distortion. So in undistorting those for projection, they tend to get pretty soft.
Well, so that's one of the trade-offs by having less cameras. The wider lens, you can have less cameras, so it's less expensive. You also have less seams, and each of the seams is a problem as you get into post-production in terms of trying to make all that match. But as you say, you have more distortion, so you're going to have image quality issues if you push that too far.
In reality, you'll have, with a true 180 fisheye, you'd have so much overlap, assuming you get your cameras reasonably close together, that you won't end up using most of that edge material anyway, because you probably have somewhere like 50% overlap, or enough that you can stay kind of in the sweet spot of those lenses.
And that will be useful, and I think what we're going to do is show as part of that shoot is I'll walk through the scenes, so I'll cross over the scenes and the blend lines, so we can actually see with the obvious benefits of having synchronized shutters, as well as image control and grading control over the things.
And we'll also see that, you know, doing that around a sort of a tighter cluster of smaller cameras like a GoPro rig, when you cross the seams, how difficult is it to repair that later on versus you crossing over when it's 2 fisheyes, seeing like how big the jump is between you and then the next closest object from a parallax standpoint.
And so I mean, the sync is one of the major issues. Now, in theory, GoPro is supposed to come out sometime next 6 months or whatever with a synchronization solution for at least their rig, so it'll be interesting when that comes out.
Well, the Hero 3s, I think a lot of people
stuck with them.
had sync
for the stereo.
Yeah,
rigs.
like people had figured out how to do that for VR. The 4s, I think were disabled in the firmware. But they'll probably, I'm sure that, you know, GoPro will be coming out with their own VR solution sooner than later, and
Yeah, and it's a neat mix because we are actually, as our second camera rig, so we're going to try and do this with the 2 high-quality rigs like the red camera and fisheye, but we're also going to use, similar to what we did in the boot camp, a GoPro rig, which is useful because it's fairly affordable. You can actually even rent the cameras. I talked about that before. The rig is compact, And the added benefit of, unlike this part that we're doing with me on camera, we're going to do it in a fairly controlled location, that part of it, so I'm not worried. But I would really like to have people do it in a busy location, at the Eiffel Tower, at Big Ben, or like I said, on Venice Beach. And in that case, you do need to capture all that at once, or you should capture all that at once. There's a lot of cleanup to do, but likely that's easier than going and cutting everyone out.
Well, you can do it with one person or two people, because it's light, it's small, it's battery powered, it records on board, it even records sound.
No permit.
Yeah, you can sort of get in, get out. Whereas a higher end solution might require a camera assistant or assistants, plural, DIT, so that you could actually
the
view the image.
It
starts to jump up a bit. The other thing to consider for people is that there are, we haven't really talked about it, but there are a lot of other compact solutions besides GoPros that offer Genlock and sync and control over exposure and color temperature and all that stuff. But they're just not, they're a lot more expensive and less readily accessible for a purpose like this.
Right. Well, I know that with the new Blackmagic micro cameras and things, those are a possibility, but then they're only 16:9 type of framing, so you need more cameras to cover. So there's no perfect solution right now. I mean,
they're not even shipping, so we can't actually shoot.
But
probably not.
I mean, one thing even with the GoPros that I've done is, even if you just have one GoPro at home and you're going to rent the rest for the shoot, you can shoot once again just like the single camera. Put it in, roll off. If you're in a room, just move it around to each position, photograph it, and assemble it. And then the other thing that's just kind of a combination of that, if you're shooting narrative film and you need the crew behind you or doing something like that, it's possible you don't record it. You do go ahead and shoot it separately and patch that in so that you can deal with practical lights or the crew or other types of rigs. So it's a combination process.
Just remembering, of course, that if you've got practical lights and you're moving them, that it won't necessarily stitch up later, because your lighting will be changed. Yeah.
Well, again, it's good. I think this discussion has been really useful. Again, taking a look at the creative, trying to figure out within the realm of the course, because we are, in fairness, trying to teach things here and show different applications. But we're trying to make sensible decisions on the equipment based upon what we're doing, as well as make it approachable for all of you out there to try and do this. Because again, there's a big difference. If you have a camera, if you have access to a Nodal Ninja, you can actually contribute to part of this project if you set it up right. And you're going to learn a lot of stuff about doing VR. So I think it's going to be a great example, and hopefully a great showpiece to kind of show off member locations for all around the world. Well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to chat for this class. For our next class, we're actually going to dive into the shooting aspect of it, both the GoPro rig as well as the Red rig, or something else if Alexa, if we end up doing that. If you have any questions, be sure to drop by the forums and ask. Until next time, thanks so much for being part of FX PhD. See ya.